How do we cross the line?
He was, for many years, one of the world's leading experts on pain, particularly the pain that was caused by deteriorating nerve diseases. He was, by trade, a hand surgeon, and in 1993, he wrote a profound book that is called The Gift of Pain. His name was Dr. Paul Brand. Dr. Paul Brand said this: "Out of my experience with the nervous system of the human body, I would propose a different kind of unity for humanity, one based on pain. I can read the health of a human body by noting how well it listens to pain. Most diagnostic tools we use, after all, fever, pulse, blood cell count, measure the body's healing response. Analogously, the health of the body of humanity depends on how the stronger parts attend to the weaker." Paul Brand was born in 1914 to missionary parents, Christian missionaries, serving in the Tamil Nadu province of India in a small town called Kali Hills. They were Christian medical missionaries, Jesse and Evelyn Brand. Paul's father, Jesse, died when Paul was just 15 years old. He died of what was called Blackwater disease. And then when Paul turned 19, his mother, Evelyn, who remained behind to serve the people of India, sent him to the United Kingdom to go to school, to go to university, where he began to study medicine. He graduated from medical school just at the beginning of World War II and did his surgical residency in orthopedics during the Blitz in London. It was then that he met a fellow surgical resident named Margaret, and a year later they were married. When the war ended in 1946, Paul and Margaret Brand returned to India. They returned to a small Christian hospital in Vellore, India, and they stayed and served there for 4 years when Dr. Brand decided to open a clinic for the treatment of Hansen's disease. Hansen's disease is otherwise known of as leprosy. And for the next 16 years in Vellore, India, the New Life Clinic was the center for cutting-edge research and treatment of people suffering from deteriorating nerve diseases such as Hansen's disease or leprosy. After 16 years at the New Life Center in India, the National Institutes of Health in America asked Dr. Brand and his wife to come to Carville, Louisiana, where they were appointed the directors of the National Research Center for Hansen's disease. He spent the next 20 years developing pioneering surgical techniques and treatments and rehabilitation protocols for people who were generally written off as unrecoverable. He became the world's foremost expert in hand surgery. In fact, if you go to the original Baylor Medical School hospital in Dallas and you walk into the original lobby, you will see cast bronze hands of dozens of famous people, including Andre the Giant, by the way. And you'll see them in glass, and they were studies conducted by Dr. Paul Brand. Upon his retirement in 1986, he was offered a professorship in orthopedics at the University of Washington Medical School, where he and his wife lived out the rest of their lives. During his life, Dr. Brand received many awards, many degrees, many accolades. He published many papers and many cutting-edge surgical techniques that are still used by hand surgeons around the world today. He was a pioneer in the study of the deterioration of the nerves caused by diabetic mellitus and Hansen's disease. He was a man who devoted his life to the study of pain. Last week we began a conversation about what it means to make a difference in the world that we live in by being willing to cross a line, by being willing to press against our limitations, by challenging the rules and the boundaries that we put up in our lives and that others put up around us, and that if we want to be people who make a difference in the world that we live in, we must be as Jesus was, line crossers, blurring the lines between the haves and the have-nots, the insiders and the outsiders, those who believe and those who struggle in their belief. If we are going to be men and women who make a difference in the world, we have to press into those lines, cross those lines. In fact, on March the 10th, Pastor Aaron Four was reminding you that on March the 10th, we're going to throw ourselves a party. We're going to have a celebration of all of the ways that the folks here and our family of faith are pressing against those boundaries, crossing over those lines. We want to encourage one another and applaud one another for all of the courageous and bold things that are going on through our family of faith in this community, in our city, in our country, and even around the world. People that are daring to be courageous enough to cross that line, to make a difference in the lives of others. But today, I want to challenge you to step across the most difficult line that we can step across. I want to challenge you to step across the line of pain. And it's not the line of our own personal pain. I think that's a fairly easy thing for us to deal with. The line that I want us to be challenged by today is the line of reaching out and pressing into the pain of others. Being willing to step across the line and attach ourselves to other people's pain. It requires a great deal of conviction. It requires incredible courage to do this. So I think it's only appropriate, before we talk any more about this, to pray together. Would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your words spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to challenge us to be courageous enough, to have the conviction to press into the pain that is all around us. Pray that in the smallest of ways, we might begin to move those lines and make a difference among those who are hurting around us. Pray for the courage to do that. Pray that for myself, and for my family, and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. The first 5 books of the Bible are commonly known of as the Torah, or the Law. The books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are attributed to Moses, and they form the core of the Jewish identity. They are the laws of Israel. And in among those first 5 books, in amongst the writings of Moses, in amongst the Torah, are 2 chapters that are dedicated to infectious skin diseases. Sounds like a rousing good read, doesn't it? Let's get together, folks, and let's have a Bible study with our teenagers about infectious, scabby, pussy skin diseases. Doesn't that sound like a good time? Praise Jesus, everybody. We're going to gather around and do a Bible study of Leviticus chapters 13 and 14. You see, in order to protect the community, in order to protect the greater good, the priests of Israel were charged with identifying and diagnosing contagious and infectious skin diseases, the most notorious of which was leprosy. So if you were a person living among the nation of Israel and you developed a rash or a scabby something on your skin and it didn't get any better, in fact, it got worse and it continued to spread, you were required by law to present yourself to the priests. And in Leviticus chapter 13, there is a detailed explanation of how a priest was going to be able to identify what would be the difference between a non-contagious and a contagious skin disease. I mean, if you had an insect bite and it got kind of nasty, or you had poison oak or poison ivy, or you had sunburn or a diaper rash or something like that, the priest would say, oh, well, don't worry about that. But the contagious infectious skin disease was told in Leviticus chapter 13 how to be identified by the priest. And the protocol in Leviticus 13 was for the priest to take 7 days. That if you came to the priest and you had the markings of some kind of contagious skin disease, they would set you outside of the camp, they'd quarantine you for 7 days. If at the end of 7 days there was no change or it got worse, the priest would pronounce you unclean. Now, as Leviticus chapter 13 unfolds, we come to the most devastating pronouncement that a priest can make. It was that if you were diagnosed and confirmed to have an infectious skin disease, and the priest identified you as unclean, that meant for the rest of your life, you were an outcast. You could no longer live with your family and friends. You could no longer live in the community of Israel. You had to live outside of the camp. You had to dress in clothes that were torn and cut and identified you as an infectious person. You had to live alone. And every time that someone came near you, you had to cover your face and you had to cry out, unclean, unclean. Can you imagine the devastation of that diagnosis? What was just an itchy, scaly part on your skin eventually causes you, for the rest of your life, to have to live alone as an outcast, as a non-human being. This was the prognosis that was accomplished through the diagnostics of Leviticus chapter 13. But Leviticus chapter 14 was the prescription for restoring a person to the community whose infectious skin disease had been healed. It was a lengthy process. The person who once was declared unclean, who is healed of that infectious skin disease, was told to present themselves to the priest. And the process was an elaborate one. It required 2 doves and 3 lambs and a measure of grain and a measure of oil and 8 days. And over the course of these presentations, the priest would examine the person and go through the ritual sacrifices that would pronounce a person now clean and welcome back into the community. It began with the presentation of 2 doves. The first dove was slaughtered over a bowl of water, and the blood from the dove poured into that water, and then the living dove was dipped in that water, and the blood and the water from that basin was sprinkled onto the person who was to be declared clean. And they did that 7 times. After doing that 7 times, they tied a scarlet thread to the foot of the living dove, and they set it free into the wilderness. The person then, according to Leviticus chapter 14, was told to wash their clothes and to shave all of the hair off of their body. And for 7 days, they were to live outside of their tent. On the 7th day, they were to repeat the shaving and washing process again. And then on the 8th day, if it turned out that they showed no signs of the disease on their body, they were to offer sacrifices. The first sacrifice was a guilt offering. See, this was a disease that was seen as more than a physical disease. It was a spiritual disease. And so the first lamb was offered, and the blood from that lamb was taken by the priest, and it was placed on the right earlobe, on the right thumb, and on the right big toe of the person to be cleansed. A second lamb was sacrificed, and that blood was mixed with oil, and that was placed again on the right earlobe, the right thumb, the right big toe, and the rest was poured over the head of the one to be cleansed. If at the end of the rituals on the 8th day, the person showed no sign of that continuing skin disease, they would offer a third lamb as a burnt offering. And that burnt offering and the aroma from that sacrifice would indicate to the community that this person was cleansed. In the 1500 years since Moses wrote the book of Leviticus until the time of Jesus, no one had ever been healed of leprosy. Well, there was one, but it wasn't a Jewish person. His name was Naaman. In 2 Kings chapter 5, a Gentile general named Naaman was healed of leprosy by the prophet Elisha. But no one had ever made the sacrifices of Leviticus chapter 14 until the day Jesus showed up in Galilee. It was at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It was early on. It was before he had performed any other public miracles. He had done a few miraculous things, and he had traveled around gathering his first disciples. He stayed in the northern region in the area of Galilee, teaching in the synagogues and teaching in the open air. This is when the Sermon on the Mount took place for the first time. And his teaching was gathering a lot of attention from the Jewish people in the northern regions of Galilee. And it tells us that one day a man who was covered with leprosy came to him. The story is recorded for us in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's recorded in Matthew chapter 8, in Mark chapter 1, and in Luke chapter 5. Each of them record the story in their own way. And so what I've done is I've done a mashup of the three Gospels. And I want to read to you the story with the combination of Matthew's point of view, Mark's point of view, and Luke's point of view. The story of the cleansing of the leper, the first public miracle of Jesus. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, Jesus was in one of the towns, and large crowds followed him. A man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him on his knees. He knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was indignant, but Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. Jesus ordered him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. The news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but Jesus often withdrew to the lonely places and prayed, yet people still came to him from everywhere. When Jesus healed the leper, he crossed a line. The most obvious line that he crossed was he crossed the line of prohibition from touching an unclean person. It's interesting that all three of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all record that Jesus touched him. He reached out his hand and he touched him, and they all made note of that, because when he did that, he was violating the law. He was violating the laws of Moses. I kind of believe that Leviticus chapter 14 was there for this moment. The cleansing that was going to take place, that had never taken place before, took place in that hour. When Jesus reached out and touched him, he crossed a line. See, he didn't have to touch him. He could have just said, "Hey, you with leprosy, you're healed." He could have spoken to him. He had that power. He could have waved his hand. He could have sent him to wash in the river like Elisha did. He could have whipped out a magic wand and said, "Alakazam, alakaboom, you're free of leprosy, go to your room," or something like that. He could have done it anyway, but he decided to touch him. And then he said, "I want you to go and not tell anyone. Don't tell anyone what has happened, but go directly to the priests and offer the sacrifices of Leviticus 14, the 2 doves and the 3 lambs and the measure of oil and the measure of grain, as a testimony to them. Because I want them to know that God is at work among them, around them, in their community. I want them to be the first to see. But the most interesting thing about the story of the healing of the leper is what only Mark records. In Mark chapter 1, verse 41, he records how Jesus felt in that moment. Now, Mark does that. Of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mark is the one who most often identifies how Jesus felt about the things that were going on. But right here, as the leper approaches him and begs him to be healed, he says Jesus was indignant. And there's a problem there. And it's not the problem you think it is. It's a different problem. It's a theological problem. Now, I'm going to have to go to Nerdland. I'm going to get all geeky on you right now. So if you want to check your Instagram feed, or you want to go and text your friends to find out where you're going to have brunch, now would be a good time to do that. You can go ahead and do that. The geeks among us, I want to share with you the problem here in Mark chapter 1, verse 41, because it's a textual problem. There's an anomaly here. There's something happening in the words in Mark chapter 1, verse 41 that happens very rarely in the Bible. I'm going to get all nerdy on you, so if you want to take a nap, go ahead and do that right now. This is your opportunity. Because we're going to talk textual criticism. You see, the Bible, and this makes sense, I'm sure, hopefully to everyone in the room, was not run off on a Xerox machine. It's not like they had copiers. It wasn't like 2,000 years ago you could copy and paste and drag and drop off the internet and send it to all your friends. If you wanted to make a copy of a written document, there was only one way to do it. Copy it letter by letter, word by word, phrase by phrase, page by page, by hand. And for 1,500 years, until the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg, that was the only way that written literature was spread, was through the actual hand copying of the documents, which means the books of the Bible, particularly the New Testament books that we have and hold in our hands, for hundreds and hundreds of years, were copied by hand, letter by letter, word by word. And down through the centuries, there have been faithful men and women who have dedicated themselves as scribes to copying and recopying the texts that they believed were sacred. And that copying was so prolific and so efficient that the Bible you have in your hand that represents those ancient manuscripts is the most accurate and precise and reliable piece of historical literature in human history. There are literally thousands of handwritten copies of most of the books of the New Testament, of the Gospels and the Epistles and Acts and Revelation. And of all of these thousands of handwritten copies, there are errors, textual errors. Because who knows, when one of the scribes came in and he was a little hungover from too much mead, and he mistook an O for an A, or he left off a word, or he had a fight with his wife the day before, and he turned the page too early, and there's a whole chunk of the book of John that's missing, or the book of Mark that's missing. But in comparison to the thousands and thousands of manuscripts that we have, 99% of what you read in your Bible is represented by the most ancient documents that we have. Except when it comes to Mark chapter 1, verse 41. Because right there in Mark chapter 1, verse 41, there are two words. If you read different English translations, you'll notice that they translate Mark 1:41 differently. The New International Version that I was using translated that it says that Jesus was indignant. But if you read the New Living Translation, it says Jesus was filled with compassion. If you read the Revised Standard Version, it says Jesus was filled with pity. If you read Eugene Peterson's paraphrase, he says Jesus was deeply moved. Well, it's because in the textual evidence, in the massive amount of copies of the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, in verse 41, there are two different words. And no one knows why. The one word is orgisthesin, or it's orgistes. Orgistes. The other word is splagnistes. Splagnistes and orgistes. Now, if you look at them on the screen, you can say, well, the end of the word looks the same, But the beginning of the word looks totally different. So it wasn't like the scribe just kind of wasn't paying attention and he changed a couple of letters. These are two different words. They have two completely different meanings. Orgistes is from the word ogre, from which we get the word ogre. It means wrath or indignation or frustration or anger. The other word, splagnistes, is the word for human intestines. For the Greeks came to describe what they felt in their gut as a splagnos. One, on the one hand, was sort of that intellectual, rational objection, and the other was this emotional gut intuition. Now, if you look at the textual evidence and you examine the texts on one side that have orgistes and the other that have splagnistes, you'll find that it's 50-50. There's no one who can say, well, this one was original and this one replaced it, because the arguments for both are equal. Now, if you've been checking your Instagram feed and your Facebook homepage and things like that, come back to me right now. Because this is awesome. Because you know what I believe, and I'm going to lose my theological card over this, that it's supposed to be that way. That this is a divine error. Because Jesus was both. He was both ogre and splagnos. He was both rationally upset and he was emotionally moved at the same time. He was torn in two. He was human and divine. He was emotional and intellectual. You see, he knew what this guy was going to do. And so he was ogre. He was frustrated that this man was coming, because he knew that if I heal you, you're going to do the opposite of what I tell you. It says in Mark chapter 1 that that's exactly what he did. That Jesus says, I am willing, be healed, but don't go tell anyone, he says. Go and present yourself to the priest. And it says immediately after he was healed, what did he do? He went and told everybody. And Jesus knew it. He looked at him and he knew it. He didn't have to be God to know that. You ever met anybody like that? You look at him and you go, oh, you're going to mess this up. This is going to be a disaster. I don't have to be God to know that. I just have to look at the look on your face. You're an accident waiting to happen. I know that in my splagnos. I know that in my gut. That you're a catastrophe. I can tell. And he knew. And he knew that when this guy did that, his reputation would explode. And he would no longer be able to go into these small villages in Galilee openly, because people would be dragging out every form of sick person that they knew. And he knew that there were people in those villages he was not going to be able to get to, because this guy wouldn't keep his mouth shut. And he knew it before he did it. And part of him was saying, don't heal him. Don't give him what he's asking for. But the other part of him was filled with compassion, was filled with splagnos, his pity. And he looked at him and he said, I know I can do for you what no one in the history of humanity can do for you. And it says that he reaches out and he touched him and he said, I am willing, and you are clean. You see, this is the line that Jesus crossed. Before he crossed the line of the law and touched the man, before he crossed the line of reaching out to him, he crossed the line that you and I have to cross. It's the line of that conflict in our soul, that conflict in us that says, I see the need, but I don't care. I see how I can help, but I don't have time. I see what I can do, the difference that I can make, but I don't want to. You see that the orge and the splagnos is going on inside of us. There's this idea that the person we want to be and the things we want to do and the difference we want to make is hindered by this line that says, I don't have time. I can't enter into your drama. I can't enter into your damage. I don't have the bandwidth. I don't have the space. I have enough problems of my own. I have enough pain without yours. Thank you very much. And the line that we have to cross if we want to make a difference in the world is that line where we evaluate, should I or shouldn't I, can I or can't I, will I or won't I? And that's a real place. And we have to press into that. As if I can't, why not? If I will, why should I? And that inner dialogue, that inner conflict that went on in that moment in Jesus goes on in us every day. But if we're going to cross the line, we have to process through that. There's an old parable, Native American parable. I don't know how reliable it is, but I've heard it so many times. It's interesting. Story of a Cherokee grandfather sitting with his grandson, telling him about the truths about life. And he says to his young grandson, inside of me, young son, there are two wolves, and these two wolves are fighting. And one of the wolves is an evil wolf. There's a wolf that is filled with rage and anger and greed and envy and jealousy. The other wolf is full of peace and kindness and gentleness and humility, and they are fighting inside of me, and they are fighting inside of you. And according to the story, the young grandson looked at his grandfather, the chief, and he says, but how do I know which one will win? And the wise chief looks at him and says, it's the one you feed. See, this is the conflict that goes on inside of us. This is the line that we have to cross. We have to deal with those fears and reservations, those apprehensions, those good reasons why we shouldn't be the person who reaches out and touches, who takes on their pain. I don't have the room for it. I believe that Leviticus chapter 14 existed for that moment there. That even though no one was ever presented to the priest as being healed from leprosy in that moment, that's why that chapter was there, so that Jesus might fulfill it. But in the fulfillment of it, he exposed us to the reality of the ugliness of the pain around us. And that's what we have to deal with. You see, leprosy wasn't just a socially horrible, a spiritually corrosive disease. It was a visually horrifying disease. You ever seen anybody with leprosy? Ancient pictures, they're hard to look at, aren't they? You know that thing that makes you want to turn away from that? That's the voice. That's the struggle. Do I want to look into the eyes of pain? Do I want to press in to the suffering of others? And that's the line we have to cross. That's the line we cross when someone downtown walks up to us and they're obviously at the end of themselves and homeless, and they say, hey man, have you got a quarter? Or they knock on our window at the corner and say, hey, do you have $1? And I'm just trying to mind my own business. I'm just trying to get to A to B. Don't put this guilt on me, man. I don't need that right now. Or maybe it's that neighbor, the chairman of the HOA, who's always complaining about your kids' bikes being out in the street or your trash cans not being moved 15 minutes after the garbage truck comes. Maybe it's that obnoxious friend of yours who's always complaining. Nothing is ever right. Maybe it's that annoying family member who politically is way over on the other side of the earth from you, and every time you see them, they're just telling you about the new things that they're discovering and how great their political point of view is, and you're like, I don't have the bandwidth to deal with your lunacy right now. Maybe it's just that extra measure of gentleness and kindness. This is what it means to press into the pain, to cross that line. But if we are going to make a difference in the world that we live in, we've got to be willing to press into it. We've got to be willing on occasion to come across it. I'm not telling you when or how to do it. I'm just saying we have to wrestle with it. We have to press into it. That's what we're going to do on March the 10th. On March the 10th. And I misspoke last week. On March the 10th, we're going to have a big ask party. Because it is a big ask. It's a big ask to say, hey, I want you to come, and I want you to press into the pain. I want you to celebrate with us those people who are crossing that line, but I want to invite you to participate with them. It's a big ask. We're going to have a big ask celebration, but it's a tough question to press into the pain. That's why Dr. Paul Brand is one of my heroes. I had wanted to meet him before he died in 2003. Never got the chance. But the books that he wrote with Philip Yancey are some of the most influential in my understanding of why God introduces pain into the world. I believe that he understood pain because he immersed himself in it. I want to leave you with a quote from one of his books called Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. Listen to the wisdom of Dr. Paul Brand. I have sometimes wondered why Jesus so frequently touched the people he healed, many of whom must have been unattractive, obviously diseased, unsanitary, smelly. With his power, he easily could have waved a magic wand. In fact, a wand would have reached more people than a touch. He could have divided the crowd into affinity groups and organized his miracles. Paralyzed people over here, feverish people over there, people with leprosy there, raising his hands to heal each group efficiently en masse. But he chose not to. Listen to this. Jesus' mission was not chiefly a crusade against disease. If so, why did he leave so many unhealed and tell his followers not to talk about the healings that they saw? But Jesus' ministry was rather a ministry to individual people, some of whom happened to have a disease. He wanted those people, one by one, to feel his love and warmth and his full identification with them. Jesus knew he could not readily demonstrate love to a crowd. For love usually involves crossing the line, across the barrier, and touching.